Hello and welcome to this introduction to a book written by myself, Dr. Catherine Kerner, and Dr. Selma Pillay. And it's called Governance and Multiculturalism, the White Elephant of Social Construction and Cultural Identities. And this book is close to both of our hearts, and we're very excited to introduce it to you today. So just introduction for myself. I've taught across many undergraduate and postgraduate programs in Australia, mostly in community and human services, also critical race and whiteness studies, and critical Indigenous studies, social policy, critical race and whiteness studies, critical Indigenous studies and social policy, critical community, and also international development counselling and sociology since 2003. So before that, I was working for 10 years in community, non-profit sector, mostly youth homelessness and also sexual violence, crisis response, prevention and advocacy. I was elected representative for rural and remote Queensland on the National Youth Coalition for Housing, which we called NIDGE. And also I received a number of awards, including being Australian finalist for International Stop Rape and Stop Rape Contest in New York with Deirdre Finter, RIP, and also a National University Indigenous Community Partnership Award with Professor Simone Olukwa and also Dr. Christopher Wilson. So I was an Australian University Quality Assurance Commendation and also Australian Awards for University Teaching and Flinders University of South Australia. So my research experience includes urban, rural and remote communities in Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australia, Indonesia, Nepal and India. And my research interests include critical race and whiteness studies, colonialism, decolonisation, pluralism and identities, including metaphysics and different understandings of identity and consciousness. My current projects include the Patients to Win Freedom with Tenzin Chopel on Indigenous Tibetan experiences of Chinese colonialism and genocide. I publish widely, and my most recent article includes the ever-expanding Circles of Compassion, which is critical race and whiteness studies, Australian e-journal. So this is just an introduction to myself. And then I'm going to read to you the introduction of the book chapter, so Governance and Multiculturalism. So the inspiration for this book came from the unsettling position of calling oneself Australian and living on stolen land whose peoples still live there and will always live there. This law, this country, these people, all the same, Gagaju. And this is a quote from Bill Nagy, who's now passed away. My non-Indigenous understanding of Gagaju elder Bill Nagy is that Gagaju law, land and people are the same entity and not live separately. Elsewhere, Nagy states to the reader, whether Gagaju, Indigenous or non-Indigenous, that he is the same as you, all the same. I belong to this earth. That's an end quote from Bill Nagy. So this is illustrated through the following quote from Bill Nagey in 2007, page 13. Soon my bones become earth, all the same. My spirit has gone back to my country, my mother. Now my children got to hang on to this story. I hang on to this story all my life. My children can't lose it. This law, this country, this people, all the same. In the context of this book, Nagey's words are a statement of Indigenous sovereignty and are a way of constructing being in place. He instructs the readers not to remove our subjectivity from the country or the community where we live, or from its people, or from its laws. His knowledge and his way of being in the world are not exclusive. Elder Bill Nagey, he provides us, the reader, both a process and a terms of engagement for living and being in Australia. This book is an attempt to contextualise the debates being in Australia. This book attempts to contextualise the debates about Australian identities in relationship to Indigenous sovereignty. It argues that the Australian context remains colonial rather than being post-colonial, and the way forward is not to construct a better Australian identity, but rather to participate in the hard treaty work where there is still no treaty, to respectfully engage with Indigenous sovereignty. So the book approach is looking at the question of race, racialisation, Australian identities, and Indigenous sovereignty. The book locates itself within critical race and whiteness studies from the UK, Canada, USA, New Zealand, and Australia, and it seeks to deconstruct the racialisation of white Australian identities and cultural relations, and it draws upon the traditions of Western sociology, cultural studies, and the emerging field of critical Indigenous studies to do so. The book is a response to public discourse that's been ongoing for decades now and is unresolved even today. This discourse is that Australia has moved or needs to move beyond its colonial past. The original intent of the book was to ask, what would it take to move beyond a white Australia? The researcher aimed to investigate whether white Australian values are a thing of the past, or if whiteness remains a hegemonic identity. After reviewing the literature, however, it seems as though this question itself also seeks to move beyond whiteness or beyond race. Is such an approach to move beyond race or whiteness, is this approach itself problematic? In the context of Australia, where the invader and settler population remains hegemonic identity that in its self-definition denies Indigenous sovereignty. This contention raises several questions in order to understand the relations of power that are enabled by the status of white Australian. How does race shape those who identify as white Australian experience their own racialised subject position and the privilege it extends to them? The main objective of this book is to do with the continuing construction of whiteness in Australian identities vis-a-vis Indigenous sovereignty, and particularly concerning everyday vocabularies and ways of talking about white selves and Australian identities and indigeneity. To achieve this, the research uses a case study of rural people who self identify as white Australian to understand how they think about Australia, how they think about race and Australian identity, and in the context of Indigenous sovereignty in their everyday lives. These subsidiary objectives follow. First, to analyse whether discourses of multiculturalism used to deal with difference obscure social construction of race. Second, to analyse what the researcher has termed the Great Divide between discourses of multiculturalism and discourses of Indigenous sovereignty. These discourses in debates about Australian identity. So the argument we present is that white Australians are ambivalent about their own racialised position and their position vis-a-vis Indigenous sovereignty. So this is because the discourse of multiculturalism has been the central story of how to understand difference under the umbrella of Australian identity. The story of migrancy and cultural difference built a national identity focused on tolerance of diverse but equal groups, and this approach replaced race with culture. There is a lack of everyday critical vocabulary about the social construction of race to address racial oppression and inequality. The national story of tolerance and acceptance does not include Australia's colonial beginnings and ongoing hegemonic relationships with Indigenous people. As such, the Australian discourses about identity and the nation continue to disavow Indigenous sovereignty and maintain white privilege. To meet the objectives, specific understandings of race, racialisation, racialised groups, nation, and identity as social constructions underpin the book. Race is viewed from an anti-realist position. That is, having no biological referent, there is no base for the word race. However, it has been used to sharp effect and has lived consequences for those who are privileged and disadvantaged by its use. Baker, 2018. Kant defined race as having the following characteristics. 1. Races form due to their reproductive isolation. 2. Races evolved as major human lineages. 3. Races are biological groups in present. 4. Race is biologically inherited. 5. Race is the taxonomic level below species to humans. 6. All human populations belong to at least one race. This is Kant, cited in Hockman 2018, page 5. This is the context of there being a total absence of real biological markers of race. Yet Hockman argues that as a group of characteristics combined, can be used as a form, a definition of race as a scientific concept. So Hockman 2018, page 5. That is a biological illusion. Hockman 2018, page 8. Hockman then gives a very concise and convincing overview of current debates regarding race. Hockman proposes the use of racialization and what he contends to be companion term racialized groups in order to adequately address the phenomenon in question that has no referent. Hockman proposes that racialization has an ontological rather than a normative thrust. It throws the reality of race into question. End quote. He draws on previous work to develop a more meaningful definition from Miles, 1989, Small, 1994, Bloom, 2002, Dada and Torres, 2003, and Hoffman, 2017b. Hoffman's definition of racialization tells us that, I quote, groups are being understood as biological races. It is a form of biologicization. It does not even tell us whether racism is taking place, end quote. 2018, page 12. Therefore, this book will apply an analysis of the power relations between racialised groups in Australia and result in privilege for some and oppression in others. The approach is political and seeks to disrupt ongoing colonial relations, whether at the same time acknowledging the agency of minority groups and the possibility to have a critical race approach. The term settler society, which is often used in a white discourse that protects hegemonic white privilege and relies on the initial lie of terra nullius and the resultant dispossession of Indigenous peoples. This book applies the theories of critical race and whiteness studies. The body of literature understands whiteness as a system of power that privileges white norms, values, and systems of knowledge. These are kept protected through white discourses and practices that tell the story of how Australia was formed as a nation, who belongs to the nation, and finally, who is imagined as sovereign. The book is also premised on the illegality of the assumption that Australia was terra nullius upon the arrival of Europeans in 1770. This means white British claims to sovereignty of what is now called Australia constitute an invasion and a subjugation of Indigenous sovereignty that was not ceded and continues not to be ceded. The concepts of nation, including the book uses the term invader colonial society to refer to the society built upon colonial violence. Chapter 2 examines in depth the concepts of nation, including the concept of nations imagining themselves as sovereign, and even though it is the state that holds illegitimate sovereignty in Australia. And Chapter 3 investigates the literature on cultural identity. This book identifies the nation as a socially constructed object. It explores the key critical work to date on the nation as an imagined community, and the subsequent process of building and maintaining the nation. A key question for building modern nations is how to manage diversity within it. Debates within multicultural literature argue that the management of diversity within this approach to nations is racialized. The book applies the literature on critical race theory to multiculturalism to examine the ongoing racialization that occurs due to the lack of a critical vocabulary around race in Australia. Further, in Australia, unlike Canada and New Zealand, the discourses of multiculturalism as pathways to nationhood have not engaged with Indigenous sovereignty. Additionally, Canada and the USA have examples of attempts to conceive of sovereignties differently. These approaches are informative for debates in Australia because they present a treaty approach to Indigenous peoples that has still never occurred in Australia. The approaches in Canada and the USA and New Zealand are not immune from overriding Indigenous sovereignty to the benefit of hegemonic state However, the debates in these countries begin with the premise that there are treaties with Indigenous nations, unlike Australia. The book places the process of building the Australian nation in its colonial context in order to understand the contemporary implications of that history as foregrounded in section 1.2 of the introduction. Separate approaches to multiculturalism and Indigenous rights are problematic because multiculturalism disguises the privilege and oppression created by a race that disavows Indigenous sovereignty. Rather, public discourse in Australia expects Indigenous First Nations to join the multicultural nation as one of many equal but different cultural groups. This approach repeats a colonising practice of sameness in the narrative of equal rights, rather than the discourse of Indigenous rights that engage with First Nation people's status as the first occupants who are sovereign subjects.